Hello, everyone, and welcome to In Plain Sight. I'm Jeremy, part of the go-to-market team here at Viso. Thanks for joining us for today's session. It's computer vision adoption in unionized workplaces. As with the rest of the series, today is a masterclass session all about making computer vision feel practical, grounded, and relevant to what industrial organizations are actually dealing with day to day. We're not here to talk about the technology in abstract terms or as something disconnected from operational reality. We are here to talk about rollout, trust, adoption, and what it really takes to make these programs work on the ground in real environments with real constraints and real stakeholders. This is a particularly important topic because when computer vision is introduced in unionized settings, or really in any workforce environment where trust matters, the conversation moves very quickly beyond the model itself. It becomes about intent, about boundaries, things like governance, communication, and whether the organization's introduced to the technology in a way that people can really understand, question, and ultimately support. That's usually where success or failure lies, long before anyone's discussing scale. So this session is really aimed at operations leaders, safety leaders, compliance leaders, transformation teams, anyone trying to work out how to introduce computer vision responsibly in a complex environment. We're going to talk about what workers and workforce representatives actually care about, what good rollout looks like in practice, and how organizations can build confidence early enough to create real momentum rather than encounter resistance. So I'm joined by Beth, one of our expert account managers who works closely with organizations thinking through these questions across safety, compliance, operational visibility, and broader transformation. Beth, great to have you here. Welcome to In Plain Sight.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think this is a really important and timely conversation because the first reaction to computer vision is often shaped less by what the system can do and more by what people think it might be there to do. So the starting point is usually not technical capability. Perhaps surprisingly, it's actually intent. So people want to know what the system is for, what the problem is going to be solving, how it will be used, what it will not be used for, and whether it's actually there to support safer, fairer, and more consistent operations. I think that is especially important in unionized environments where workforce confidence and consultation carry real weight. But it is also true more broadly in any organization where the workforce needs to believe that deployment is legitimate and proportionate. And I think that is why this topic matters beyond one specific setting. So a lot of organizations now recognize the operational potential of computer vision, but the ones that move successfully are usually the ones that understand that a rollout is not just a technical exercise. So it's also a workforce confidence exercise. If people actually trust the program, it's going to move forward. If they don't, even for the really strong use cases, it can struggle to get a fair hearing.
Such a great intro, Beth, and that is, for me, exactly it. Before anyone gets to value, they need confidence in the purpose, in the boundaries, and as you said, the intent behind the program. If those are unclear, everything else gets harder from the outset, no matter how promising the use case may be. So if we may, let's start with the bigger picture first and why this feels so relevant now. Why does this feel like such a timely conversation at this moment?
For me, it's because workforce concern is completely understandable. So if computer vision is introduced with vague language, with weak communication or unclear safeguards, people can then quickly associate it with surveillance or assume the worst. And I think once that perception sets in, it becomes much harder to have a practical conversation around the real use cases because the discussion is no longer about what the system is actually doing. I think it becomes more about what people might fear that it's going to become. So, in most cases, the concern is not abstract resistance to the technology. It's much more grounded than that. People want to know how the data is handled. They want to know whether the use case is fair, whether the deployment is proportionate to the actual operational problem that's being addressed, whether workers are being consulted early enough, and whether there is clear accountability for what the program will run in practice.
Interesting. So, would you say the concern is less we reject this category of technology and more show us clearly what this is, show us how it works, what the limits are, and whether it's being introduced responsibly?
Yes, exactly right. Because if that uncertainty builds early, valuable initiatives can stall before they even get that fair evaluation. And that can delay real gains in safety, compliance, operational visibility, and incident prevention. It can also then slow progress in wider areas like lean improvement, quality, consistency, resource efficiency, ESG performance, and Industry 4.0 transformation. Because organizations never get past the adoption barrier to test the value properly. And I think the important thing is that the value is very real when computer vision is being deployed for the right use cases with the right safeguards. So it can help to identify hazards earlier, improve PPE and process compliance, reduce near misses, strengthen investigations, and give teams better frontline visibility into what is actually happening across the organisation. It can also support more consistency in how standards are applied, which is valuable both for safety and for day-to-day operational discipline.
Fabulous and very well said, Beth. It makes me think that there's a genuine cost to getting the kickoff wrong, as it's not just that a project becomes harder. Would it be more that organizations may delay the improvements they need because the rollout doesn't quite get to the point where it can be judged safely on its own merits?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with that. And that is why the distinction between responsible use and intrusive use matters so much. So, in practice, that distinction usually comes down to purpose, proportionality, transparency, governance, and the boundaries set around the system. So, if those things are strong, trust becomes a lot easier to build. If they are weak, people then assume that the program is going to be weak as well.
Got it. That's definitely a useful and relatable way to frame it. Thank you. From a personal perspective, I think what's key is the upside is real, but the path to that upside depends on whether the program feels clear and controlled from the beginning, which for me really takes us to the central point underneath all of this. And that's what actually drives adoption in the first place. So, Beth, you've got a great way of keeping things clear and simple. If you had to boil down this whole topic of today into one key insight, what might that be?
So I would say that the key insight is that trust is the core adoption condition. I think workforce stakeholders do not generally evaluate computer vision based on technical sophistication. They evaluate it through the lens of purpose, fairness, trust, and practical impact on people's day-to-day work. So for me, the real question is definitely not what we often hear, which is, can the system do this? In practice, it's more, is this program clear, proportionate, well-governed, and visibly beneficial? If those things are not in place, even a technically strong deployment will actually struggle to win support because people are not really assessing the technology in isolation. They're assessing the way the technology is being introduced into their environment.
Another really important distinction, I think the way I describe it is you're not just introducing a tool, you're asking people to trust the way that tool sits inside the operation, and then the rules behind it, and then the intent behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think confidence grows when an organisation can explain what the system is for, exactly what problem it's going to solve, what data is and is not being used, and how the outputs are acted on, and how workers benefit from it as well. When those answers are concrete, people can engage with the real deployment rather than reacting to assumptions or projecting broader fears onto it. And that matters even more because trust in the first use case shapes what happens after it. So, if the first deployment is introduced responsibly and credibly, it becomes much easier to move from one successful use case to a wider rollout across sites, across teams, and across functions. The first deployment becomes a proof point, not just for the technology, but for the organization's judgment and governance, and it paves the way to real momentum.
Got it. So the first deployment's actually doing two jobs at once. It's solving that immediate problem to start with, but it's also setting the tone for everything that comes next. And would you say that's including whether the organization earns the right to expand as well?
Yeah, exactly. I think that is when organizations begin to shift from asking, should we try one detection, to asking, how do we build a trusted operating model for safety, for quality, and for continuous improvement? And that is a very different level of maturity because it moves the conversation from isolated experimentation to repeatable capability. This is also where the platform story becomes important. So, once governance, privacy controls, and stakeholder confidence are in place, it becomes much more practical and cost effective to layer additional use cases and expand to more sites on the same platform. So, good governance is definitely not a handbrake on momentum. It is what makes repeatability, scale, and long term ROI actually possible. Without that trusted foundation, every new use case feels like starting the conversation all over again from zero.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Beth. For me, that is probably the key takeaway from this section. Trust is not a soft issue sitting off to the side. It's the condition that determines whether rollout gets traction, whether the first deployment earns that credibility, and whether the business can build from there in a structured way. And I think once you see it that way, the next question becomes very obvious. For me, that's what do workers in a broad range of workforce representatives actually look for when they decide whether to trust AI vision? So when unions, worker representatives, HSE teams, and other employees look at computer vision, Beth, what do you think are the main things they tend to care about?
Well, the first is definitely clear purpose. So, what exactly is the system designed to do, and why does this use case matter? If that is vague, then trust is immediately harder to build. I think people want to understand the operational reason, not just that the technology exists or that the business wants to be more innovative. The second, I would say, is clear limits. So, what will the system not be used for? What are the boundaries? That question matters because it shows whether the organization is being disciplined and proportionate or whether the scope feels more open ended. Quite often, confidence grows from the limits being defined as much as the use case being defined. I think once purpose and limits are clear, success is inevitable.
Interesting. So, straight off the bat, people are looking for discipline, not just what the system does, but where the line is, how controlled it is, and whether the organization's thought really seriously about the scope.
Yeah, exactly. And then privacy and fairness come in very quickly after that. People want to know what data is being captured, how it's being processed, who can access it, how long it's being retained. And they also want to know whether the use case is proportionate to the risk or the operational problem that is being addressed. If the use case feels excessive relative to the problem, I think that's when the trust can drop really quickly. Transparency matters too, but in a very practical sense. So workers want to understand what is being detected, what triggers an alert, what is reviewed by a human, and how these alerts or insights are actually being used. If that is explained really clearly, people have something real to assess rather than filling in those blanks themselves.
Got it. Makes sense. I imagine the process matters almost as much as the answers, then, right? Even a reasonable use case can create some understandable degree of friction if the workforce feels it's just been dropped on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Worker agency matters. So, were employees and workforce representatives informed early enough? Were they heard properly? Could concerns be raised before everything was already decided? I think this is a huge impact on whether the rollout feels credible or whether it feels imposed. Then there is consistency and accountability. So are all standards applied objectively across roles, across shifts and sites? Who owns the deployment? How are decisions reviewed and assessed? And what happens if there is still a concern or a challenge? In unionized and multi-site environments especially, fairness, consistency and accountability are absolutely central. And ultimately, people want to know whether there is a real worker benefit, whether it improves safety, reduces avoidable risk, supports consistency, or improves working conditions in that meaningful way.
Fantastic. So I'll try and pull that together. For me, then, the trust test is actually very practical in essence. Purpose, limits, privacy, fairness, transparency, involvement, then accountability, and crucially, that visible benefit. Those for me are the things that decide whether a rollout feels legitimate or not. And then once those questions are on the table, the best way to make the conversation real is usually with real world examples. So if we can, let's now shift gears and bring this down to the level of actual use cases. Beth, I'm going to ask you to dive into some real world and practical examples. So, where do you see the strongest entry points when organizations want to introduce computer vision credibly?
Yeah, great question. Safety monitoring is often the clearest place to start because the value is easier to explain and the worker benefit is really visible. So that could include PP compliance, restricted zones, unsafe access, vehicle pedestrian separation, line of fire risks, blocked walkways, spill detection, near misses, or checks related to lockout tagout procedures. These are all examples where computer vision can really help identify those risks earlier and also support intervention before something escalates. So the conversation becomes less about technology watching people and more about preventing harm and really supporting day-to-day protection in a very practical way. That framing matters because it keeps the purpose concrete and relevant to what the workers already care about.
Such a great and comprehensive list. That really is spot on. And for me, that matters because it gives the rollout a very obvious operational logic. People can see why it's there, what it's trying to reduce, and then crucially, how it links to safer working conditions in a very direct way.
Yeah, for sure. And it also supports the broader shift that many organizations are trying to make from reactive reporting to earlier prevention. So instead of relying on reported incidents or those occasional observations, they gain a more continuous line of sight into those unsafe conditions and procedural deviations. That can support faster follow-up, stronger accountability, and better frontline visibility for both leaders and for the teams. It makes safety management more proactive and much more measurable, which is valuable in its own right before you even get to the wider business case around, the lost time, operational disruption, and compliance exposure.
Well said. I think the thing that we see is that makes the first use case easier to explain because it's tied to something people already understand explicitly, reducing exposure and intervening sooner. But beyond immediate safety, where else do you see this resonating across a broad range of industries?
Another strong category is consistency and fairness. So, computer vision can support standardized checks and more objective observations, which reduces that over reliance on subjective manual auditing. That really matters in unionized environments because consistency is such a big part of trust. So, if standards are meant to apply equally, organizations need a way to make that real in practice. Then there is also compliance and quality support. So, process adherence, sanitation compliance, inspection completion, required operating steps, and quality related procedural checks are all really strong examples of this. That is often where organizations start to see that once one trusted use case is in place, the same platform can actually support wider goals around compliance, quality, and efficiency and continuous improvement. So the examples are not just useful for the first conversation, they also help to show what responsible expansion can look like over time.
Fabulous. So I think the examples there are doing two things at once. First, they make that initial deployment easier to justify because the benefit's tangible. But secondly, they help the business case see how a trusted first use case can open the door to unlock that broader operational model later on that you talked about before. Um, and here we go, another segue. That brings us to the next question. And that for me would be, what does good rollout actually look like in practice if an organization wants that first deployment to be credible enough to build on? I'm sure you hear this a lot in your role, Beth. If an organization really wants to get this right from the get-go, from the outset, what does good look like in practice?
Yeah, so it usually starts with choosing one use case that has really strong operational logic and visible worker benefit, and also a business case that leaders can stand behind. So I think the best first use cases are going to be really easy to explain and to govern and meaningful enough to matter both to the site teams and to leadership. If the starting point is too vague, too sensitive, or too disconnected from the real operational value, it becomes much harder to build alignment. So the first decision is often less about ambition and more about that credibility. It sounds very simple, but it is a very important discipline.
That's a really good line, actually. That completely nails it for me. Less about ambition, more about credibility. That's really good. Start with something clear enough to explain, I guess, and then practical enough to govern, and beyond that, useful enough to matter.
Yeah, exactly. And then involve the right stakeholders early. So that may include workforce representatives, site leaders, HSE, operations, privacy, legal, IT, and program owners. The important thing is that the rollout is not treated only as a technical implementation. So it needs operational ownership, governance ownership, and communication ownership from the very beginning. Organizations also need to be really explicit about purpose, boundaries, success criteria, and how the system will actually be used. So, privacy and governance should be built into program design from day one with named ownership, documented controls, clear escalation paths, and policies that people can genuinely understand. So, if those controls only exist in theory, they will not build confidence on the ground.
So getting this right means there's very clear structure, clearly. Choose well, involve early, define clearly, and make the controls visible rather than assumed. Would you say that's a fair summary?
Yes. And communication is a huge part of that. So the strongest programs communicate in plain language. Workers and site stakeholders should be able to understand the value, the safeguards, and the intent without needing to decode a technical or legal presentation. If people need translation to understand what a program is actually doing in practice, that is already a warning sign. It is also really important to measure success in a balanced way. So, not just in terms of technical performance, but for worker protection, compliance improvement, operational performance, and process consistency. I think that over time, the goal is to create a repeatable framework that works across the business while still allowing for that local adaptation. This is what turns the first trusted deployment into the basis of a broader rollout and for layering more use cases on that same platform.
Brilliant. Thanks, Beth. And I think that last bit really is the thread that's running through all of this. Good rollout is not just about getting the first project live. Good rollout's about designing that first project in a way that can be trusted, repeated, and extended. So we are getting close to the finish line. And if I may, can we briefly pressure test that a bit? So when you look at organizations that handle this well, what patterns do you tend to see most often as they layer on use cases and scale?
Yeah, I would say they usually start with clarity rather than complexity. So they explain the use case in practical terms, define the purpose really clearly, and make the boundaries visible. So that creates legitimacy because workers can understand what is being introduced, why it matters, and how it fits into the operation. It feels much more deliberate rather than vague. They also treat safeguards as enablers rather than obstacles. So, privacy controls, defined governance, and early engagement are often exactly what make the deployment credible enough to move forward. Those things are not slowing the project down. They are actually what allow progress to happen in a way that people really trust.
Lovely. That's a great summary. Something I hear often is that the stronger programs are not dodging the hard questions. In fact, they're answering them early on. They're answering them plainly. And they're showing that the controls are part of the design rather than something added under pressure later. And that's something that I've heard us call privacy by design.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think they understand that computer vision is both an operational initiative, but also a workforce initiative. So it's not enough for the model to work. The rollout has to work as well. And this means taking frontline realities seriously, engaging early enough to surface concerns before they harden into resistance, and making consultation practical rather than symbolic. It also means recognizing that local context matters, especially in those global organizations. So the strongest businesses work from a common framework, but they also allow enough flexibility for local labour expectations, privacy requirements, and site conditions. So consistency does matter, but rigid uniformity is not always the same thing as having consistency.
That's such a good point on consistency. And that's probably where the best programs start to separate themselves from more disconnected deployments because they're building that model that can travel, not just a one off deployment that happens to work in one place.
Yeah, because they show worker benefits and business benefits together rather than treating them as competing goals. So, when people can see fewer exposures, more consistent compliance, faster intervention, better visibility, and confident site level decision making, adoption becomes much easier to support. That is the point where organizations begin to move from a single project towards a scalable operational model that can support safety, quality, efficiency, compliance, and those broader transformations over time. And that is really where the strategic value starts to compound.
So thank you so much, Beth. That was really comprehensive and so insightful. Thank you. Before we close, then, let's touch on a couple of the questions that leaders usually ask when they're about to begin this journey themselves. Many thanks to you all for the audience questions you've submitted. We'll get to as many as we can, but if yours don't get answered live right now, we'll most definitely get back to you alongside our follow-up after this session. So, Beth, a common question is, and I can see it's come up again here, what are the most important early conversations to have before rollout begins?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So I would always say to start with purpose, boundaries, and especially stakeholder involvement. So be able to explain exactly what problem is being solved, why the use case is appropriate, what the system is not going to be used for, and who needs to be involved in shaping that rollout. So I think those early conversations often determine whether the initiative is seen as credible or questionable. A second common question is what good governance looks like without making implementation too slow. Usually the answer is clarity rather than complexity. So, named ownership, practical controls, understandable policies, and defined review process do far more for adoption than having a heavy framework that nobody on the sites can actually follow.
Nice one. Got it. So again, I think to that consistency point earlier, the pattern seems to be fairly similar. Be specific early, involve the right people, and make the governance usable rather than theoretical. Let's have another look. How does this differ for multi-site or global organizations dealing with different labor expectations and privacy requirements? Beth, what would your take on that be?
Yeah, so I think the most effective approach is usually a common framework with room for that local adaptation as well. So these principles should be consistent, but consultation, privacy controls, and communication may need to reflect the local context. So that balance, I think, is what helps organizations scale without becoming rigid.
Brilliant. We're close to time now, so let's wrap up. Can you see us home with the main takeaway from today, please, Beth?
Absolutely. So I would say the main takeaway is that successful computer vision adoption depends on how the technology is introduced in practice. The most important question is not whether the system is advanced, it is whether it is implemented with enough clarity, trust, and responsibility to succeed operationally. When deployed well, computer vision can improve safety, consistency, compliance, and visibility all at the same time. It can also support wider priorities around operational excellence, ESG, waste reduction, and digital transformation. And when that trust is built early, organizations create the conditions for repeatability, for broader rollouts, stronger ROI, and the ability to layer additional use cases over time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Beth. And I think that's probably the best and most logical place to end and wrap up for today. My key takeaway would be a strong first deployment does more than solve one problem. It creates the credibility and the operating model needed to turn computer vision from a one off implementation into what I'd consider a strategic operational capability. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. A very quick plug. If you would like to explore this further, I would wholeheartedly recommend taking a look at our resources section on the website and especially our health and safety toolkit. That includes our use case builder and ROI calculator, both of which are things that we've touched on today, and also wider guidance on responsible rollout, operational adoption. Our latest tools include downloadable PDFs that are free for you to use as well. And these include a readiness checklist and a deployment roadmap. We'd love your feedback on those tools as well, and of course on the In Plain Sight series. So, right, plug officially over. Thanks again, everyone. We will see you next time on In Plain Sight. From Beth and I and all the team here at Viso, stay safe, stay well, and see you next time.